Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 63, The Baltic Crusades Part 2, The Teutonic Order. Before we begin, a big thank you to new boyars, Marcello, Mark, and Tim, and thank you also to everyone subscribing through Spotify or Apple Podcasts. The latest members episode is out on the arrival of Christianity in the Caucasus, where Armenia became the first country to make Christianity its official religion. Now, you're probably wondering where this episode was 2 weeks ago, and the answer is simple. There was supposed to be an interview episode on the Teutonic Order with archaeologist Alexander Pluskowski, author of the recently published The Teutonic Knights, Rise and Fall of a Religious Corporation, but unfortunately he came down sick on the day we were supposed to record, and I wasn't able to write and record an alternative episode on time due to other commitments. Anyway, here's the episode now, and for better or worse, you are stuck listening to me on the subject. So let's get on with it. The Teutonic Order got its start within what we might think of as the more traditional Crusader world. Saladin's conquests in the Holy Land and the loss of Jerusalem prompted calls for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. The first had been a primarily French affair. The second, as we've heard, successfully recruited from the Germans of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as giving them the start on their crusades into northeastern Europe. The Third Crusade attracted even more German participants, this time led by the Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, accompanied by his son, also Frederick, this time of Swabia, and assorted German nobles, knights, and bishops. They planned to set off on St. George's Day, were delayed, but eventually set off in a fleet of 50 ships with around 12,000 men, mostly from Bremen and Lübeck. Barbarossa ended up playing little role in the crusade. He fell off his horse while crossing a river and drowned. Half the army went home, but his son carried on with 5,000 men to join the siege of Acre in October. This Frederick died of dysentery a few months later, and Leopold V of Austria took over. Shortly after, Philip of France and Richard the Lionheart of England and Normandy turned up, secured what was left of the Crusader states, and began their fruitless efforts to recover Jerusalem. The origins of the Teutonic Order lie in the siege of Acre. A small group of Germans established a hospital outside the city, supposedly just a small tent made out of a sail. The group formed a lay brotherhood that looked after the wounded and buried the dead. They began to attract attention, and Guy of Lusignan, still passing himself off as the King of Jerusalem, promised that when they retook the city they could have the Armenian hospice. When Frederick of Swabia was dying of dysentery, he asked to be cared for at the hospital and that they take care of his burial. This got the Hospitallers involved, as they made a lot of money from a monopoly on burials in Acre. Frederick also asked his brother Henry, the new Holy Roman Emperor, to obtain papal recognition for the hospital. When the Crusaders took Acre, Guy remembered his promise and did indeed give them some buildings, which gradually expanded into a German quarter complete with castle. The following year, the Hospitallers recognized the German hospital and its master, and Henry continued to provide support, property, and trading privileges, especially in southern Italy, which gave the fledgling order an economic base. The Pope recognized the order in 1196 under the name of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem, on the hope that they would one day be able to establish themselves there. St. Mary's being a church that had belonged to the Hospitallers in Jerusalem before Saladin took it. It began to be referred to as the Ordinus Teutonici in the 13th century, and the name the Teutonic Order only entered usage in English in the 16th century. Emperor Henry IV joined a crusade to the Holy Land to complete the work of the Third Crusade. He has made a brief appearance in our podcast before as the husband of Yevpraxia of Kiev, his second wife, as discussed by Christian Raffensperger. Henry's contribution was as minimal as that of his predecessors, and he died not long after reaching Acre. The remaining leaders of the crusade, nobles including Frederick, Duke of Austria, called for the militarization of the new order to join the efforts to recover Jerusalem. This call was approved. They were given the rules of the Templars to govern their military side and the rules of the Hospitallers for their continuing role of care. Now members had to swear obedience, celibacy, and poverty. They began to feel like the Hospitallers were trying to swallow them, so they aligned themselves with the Templars. The first master was a Templar named Henry Walpot of Bassenheim, who marked his appointment by knighting the first knights of the Teutonic Order. The Pope gave them the task of waging war against the enemies of Christendom. Support continued to flourish. The order received grants of property and privileges around the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as accumulating gifts from crusaders grateful for their care. Before long, they had the resources to make their own investments and increase their wealth further. If you recall Christian Raffensperger's discussion of Henry IV, he, like other medieval rulers, had a serious conflict with the Pope, going as far as getting excommunicated. Although the order was close to the emperor and other German noble families, it maintained political neutrality and did well by taking advantage of opportunities to act as an intermediary between the emperor and other German nobles and the papal authority. So how did we get from here to the Baltic? In 1210, a minor noble from Thuringia, Hermann of Salza, became the order's fourth master. The order already had properties in Italy, Sicily, Cyprus, and Cilicia, as well as Utrima, and they were beginning to acquire properties in the Holy Roman Empire. The order laid the foundations for its military reputation in the Fifth Crusade, where they joined the campaign in Egypt. Although the crusade ended as a failure, the Teutonic Knights were at the forefront of early successes, and Hermann took on a significant role in diplomacy. All this helped recruitment to the growing order. Hermann travelled to Frankfurt to help with efforts to recruit the next crusade, and the order arranged ships to transport volunteers. He extended his diplomatic efforts to relations between the emperor and Denmark and Italy, as well as continuing to be involved in negotiations with Muslim leaders that resulted in the return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to the Christians. The order also began to move northwards, not to the Baltic, but to Hungary. King Andrew II asked the knights to help defend his eastern border. We have very limited sources on this period, just a few papal documents and archaeological sites. Given what came later, it has been treated as a precursor to the Baltic, but to what extent is hard to assess. Andrew gave the knights land in Burzenland, southeast Transylvania, where they were to become a bulwark against the Cumans. The area was populated by Pechenegs, who had been driven east by the Cumans and settled. They remained largely pagan, which meant that proselytizing was another task for the order. The charters given to the order described the land as uninhabited and instruct the knights to build castles and towns. They were allowed to collect tithes from non-Hungarian residents. The evidence suggests that the knights built 5 castles, although the site of only one has been found. Some of them appear to be beyond the territory they were granted, carving out a new region in Cuman lands and expanding towards the Black Sea. A letter from Pope Gregory IX states that the order was successful in blocking the Cumans from entering Transylvania. Cuman attempts to attack their strongholds were defeated, and the Cumans were supposedly being baptized. In 1221, Andrew revoked the order's privileges. We don't know why. The first explanation that comes to mind is that the order had been too successful. Its stone castles and territorial expansion created a new rival power that the king could not tolerate. An alternative theory is that the order was blocking missionary activity among the Cumans. A Dominican mission was sent in 1221, but could make little headway given the ongoing fighting. Less than a year later, Andrew reversed himself again and issued the order a new charter, including salt trading rights and confirmation of their territorial expansions in Moldavia. By 1223, the Christian population of the order's lands had grown sufficiently for the Pope to appoint a bishop. But whatever the issue between Andrew and the order had been, it was still clearly in the background. In early 1225, the order was expelled from Transylvania by a Hungarian army led by Andrew. Over the next few months, they petitioned the Pope and the king to return, but in February 1226, a papal commission confirmed the king's ruling that they had exceeded their privileges and occupied royal property without permission, although the Pope still scolded the king for taking action before he had approved it. By the time they lost Burzenland, the order already had the groundwork for their shift to the Baltic. In 1222, Henry the Bearded, Piast Duke of Silesia and later High Duke of all Poland, led a crusade against the Prussians who had been raiding his land. The crusade aimed to take the Zemia Czerminska, or Kulmerland as it was known in German. The region had been controlled by Poland previously as part of Mazovia, but the Prussians had destroyed the towns other than Kulm. The Teutonic Knights and Templars accompanied the crusade, although their successes were short-lived and the Prussians slaughtered the Silesian troops stationed there in 1224. As Alex Bluskowski writes, this was a border situation in many ways similar to the one the Knights were dealing with in Hungary. Poland was in a fractured state at the time, and there was a brief civil war among the dukes in 1223. Conrad of Mazovia, who was aiming to become High Duke, needed to take Krakow, and he saw the Teutonic Order as a resource to take care of some of his security needs. He wrote to Hermann of Salza offering Kulmerland to the Order if they could secure it. The Order was busy in the Levant and Hungary and did not accept the offer straight away. But Conrad kept trying, and in spring 1228, a charter was issued giving the Order Kulmerland and Orłów, a village in nearby Kuyavia. The Bishop of Prussia, a fairly nominal position as Prussia was outside of his control, sweetened the pot with a grant of his tithes from Kulmerland. The Order was still slow to respond, leaving Conrad to try to establish his own Knights of Christ of Prussia, but they were ineffective, and Conrad had to go back to the Teutonic Order with a better charter. Hermann of Salza had been busy mediating between Frederick II and the Pope, but around this time the papal legate, William of Modena, who we met in the previous episode, returned from Livonia to Italy and was keen to discuss getting the knights involved in Mazovia. In 1230, Conrad signed a new charter prepared by Hermann of Salza and William of Modena. This time, he not only gave the Order Kulmerland, he also guaranteed their independence and gave them the right to rule any territories that they conquered from the enemies of Christianity. The charter was backed with donations of substantial properties in Kulmerland from the bishops of Prussia and Plock. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor also reached an agreement in the Peace of San Germano, and in September the Pope guaranteed the Order's rights to the land that they had been awarded in Prussia. From now on, all the Pope's support for the Order would be aimed at the Baltic, not the Levant. The Order was now ready to go to war in the north, a war that would last for more than 50 years. Henry of Livonia's chronicle that was discussed last time ends just before this all starts, but we have another chronicle. This one is written by a man named Peter of Duisburg, a priest brother of the Teutonic Knights, who lived in the late 13th to early 14th century. His Chronicon Terrae Prussae, Chronicle of the Prussian Land, was completed in the late 1320s and covers the history of the Teutonic Order from its origins up to that point, in 4 volumes: a prologue, the history of the Order, the conquest of Prussia, and contemporary events. It's a very biased text, written as propaganda for the Teutonic Order to justify the conquest of Prussia, but still the most important source on the subject. The Knights had been gradually building their presence on the borders of Conrad's territory over the period leading up to the granting of the Charter. Their forces were built mainly from knights coming directly from Germany rather than transferring from the Levant or Hungary. They built a small fortress on the Vistula, Vogelsang, to become their base of operations, and a knight named Hermann Balck was appointed the Master of Prussia. He began expanding Vogelsang's fortifications to include a harbour and made room for a bigger garrison. The total number of knights was still small, but they could draw on aid from Conrad. After all, it was his idea that they were there, and they could use their papal bulls to recruit locally. Dominican monks were ordered to provide support, and they ran recruiting efforts, preaching across Germany, Poland, and Moravia. These campaigns provided a constant stream of recruits that was key to the Order's early successes. The Order crossed the Vistula with Mazovian forces in support early in 1231. They attacked the Prussian forces and seized and refortified abandoned strongholds across Kulmerland. Prussians they defeated were given only one choice: to convert and accept the authority of the Order, which meant military service, taxes and tithes. Also in 1231, the Order established Torun in Polish, as a fortified bridgehead on the Vistula. They built a castle on the ruins of the old Mazovian fortress overlooking the river. In the following year, they built Potterberg and Althaus. The Order displayed a characteristic flexibility at all of these sites. When the first choice of location proved vulnerable to flooding, they dismantled the castles and reused the materials, building them at better sites. In 1233, a city charter was issued to Kulm, which became the basis for the Kulm Law. The Kulm Law was a modified version of the Magdeburg Law commonly used by German towns. A part of the modifications related to the role of the Order. Others dealt with local residents. In particular, the Kulm Law provided for citizens to elect their local judges and for equal inheritance rights for men and women. These and other minor provisions were seen as providing more benefits to local residents than the Magdeburg laws, and the law became widely adopted across the region, including outside of areas under control of the Teutonic Order, and it strongly influenced the development of municipal government in northern, central and eastern Europe. Over 220 towns and cities adopted charters based on Kulm law, including Warsaw. The Order quickly brought Kulmerland under control and then turned its attention northwards into Pomerania, a borderland region between the Pomeranians and the Prussians. They built a new fort at Marienwerder, Kwidzyn in Polish, as a base for attacks on Pomerania and Pogisania. The Prussians captured Bishop Christian of Prussia and held him prisoner for 5 years, which was actually to the benefit of the Order, as it removed a rival who often objected to how they were running their territories. The Order took over the bishop's missionary base, Xantia, and made it an administrative centre for Pomerania. The Order continued expanding its territory by pushing forwards and building forts to control their new territory. By 1237, the Order was approaching the Baltic coast. They built a timber fort to winter at a place called Herrenpfeil, an island in the Elbing River near a small settlement. The next year, a Dominican friary was established in the settlement, now also called Elbing, Elblag in Polish, and was attracting the migrants that would make it a major Hanseatic city. The year after that, the timber fort was replaced with a brick and stone castle and church, and in 1251 it became the seat of the Order's government in Prussia for the next 7 years. Meanwhile, the Order also expanded into Livonia, this time without fighting. If you recall from last episode, the Bishop of Riga, Albert of Livonia, had established the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, another monastic order, back in 1202. The Sword Brothers' mission was ostensibly more defensive, they were supposed to protect priests and missionaries and support the conversion of the pagans, but they also aimed to conquer territories and build and garrison castles in the same way as the Teutonic Knights. The Sword Brothers had had a mixed history so far. They were in conflict with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor over what their aim should be. They lacked the Teutonic Knights' crusader reputation, which made recruiting difficult, and they were in disagreement with the Bishop of Riga relating to conquered territories. The papal bull had given the Sword Brothers a third of the land that they conquered, but made them subordinate to the bishop. Land had also been acquired in territories within the remit of other bishops, which made the order subject to those bishops too. Disputes over control of these lands would go as far as military confrontation between the Sword Brothers and the bishops, and required the intervention of papal legates, but remained unresolved. Alcuin, the master of the order, was resisting pressure to launch a new campaign against the pagans, but in February 1236 the Pope issued a bull declaring a crusade against the Lithuanians. Alcuin delayed, as the brothers were arguing over what their target should be, but at the end of summer a new group of crusaders arrived from Holstein, demanding action. The Sword Brothers were joined by troops from Pskov, as well as local Livonians, Latgalians, Curonians, and Estonians, and Folkwin decided to strike Samogitia, thinking that establishing control over the coast would enable Livonia to connect to the territory of the Teutonic Knights. The campaign followed a scenario that we have frequently encountered in history. The Crusaders marched into Samogitia. Facing little opposition, they raided and pillaged as they went, but by the time they turned towards home, their victims were already gathering their forces. As they headed back, they found some Samogitians staunchly defending a river crossing. The land was swampy and badly suited for mounted knights, but the Holsteiners did not want to fight on foot, so they camped for the night. By morning, the main pagan army, probably led by a man named Vicintus, who would become Duke of Samogitia in the emerging kingdom of Lithuania, arrived in force. The lighter pagan troops were faster and more mobile. The heavy knights bogged down in the wet terrain, and Samogitian javelins wreaked havoc among their horses. On foot, the knights were helpless against the long spears the Samogitians carried. Less than 10% of the Livonian army managed to escape. Master Folkwin was among the killed, and the Sword Brothers were so weakened that they were incorporated into the Teutonic Order, although they retained some autonomy in their territories. The Teutonic Order sent 60 knights with around 600 supporting staff to Livonia. The order agreed to hand northern Estonia over to Denmark in exchange for military support, and Järvia, now Järve, in central Estonia, which was not controlled by any of the bishops. This agreement will result in the order agreeing to support the Danish crusade against Novgorod that William of Modena had been agitating for. However, the order mainly put its resources into consolidation, building up the bases already established by the Sword Brothers into castles and fortresses. Riga remained the most important base, but an impressive new castle was built in Fellin, Estonian Viljandi. The order also strengthened their southern defences against the threat from The successes of the early and mid-1230s were followed by setbacks. In 1238, War broke out between the Duke of Pomerania, Sviatobelk, and his brother Sambor, which interrupted the Order's supply lines. The Order in Poland took Sambor's side, so Sviatobelk allied with the Prussians and began attacking the Order's fortresses. The Order retained Elbing, Kulm, and Thorn, but lost most of the territory that it had conquered. The war continued until the Treaty of Christburg in February 1249, which granted it essentially equal rights to Prussian converts, provided that they abandoned pagan practices. The peace didn't take, and the war continued until 1253. Despite this, the Order continued to entrench its control in the Baltic. It introduced a new administrative structure and persuaded the Pope to give it control over missions to the region. They received the right to choose Dominican preachers and a veto over who was allowed to preach. Soon they also received the right to grant indulgences to crusaders themselves. When Pope Innocent IV was elected in 1243, the Order asked for new crusading bulls for Prussia and Livonia. The Pope issued bulls allowing the Order to recruit crusaders for its wars as it saw fit, for an unlimited period and with no obligations to preach and convert. The Order could now run a permanent crusade in Prussia. A few years later, the Order was authorized to preach its own crusades. Papal approval was no longer required. They could announce their own crusades and recruit whenever, wherever. Been made with Pomerania, and the Order turned its attention to eastern Prussia. They began in 1254 with an unsuccessful incursion from Livonia into Samland. Then, in the winter, they assembled the largest Crusader army yet, supplemented by troops from Bohemia and Brandenburg, and attacked the Sambians. The Sambians were smashed. Within days, they were lining up to be baptized and swearing allegiance to the Order. A new fortress was established on the banks of the Pregel River, Königsberg, now Kaliningrad. Sambians who swore allegiance had their lands and privileges restored, and equal rights to German knights. This secured the land for the Order and allowed them to begin a new campaign against Samogitier. But Prussia is far from pacified. We are already ranging quite far ahead of where we are in the main narrative. So for now, we will be leaving the Baltic Crusades. We will return to German colonization of the Baltic later, once we have caught up with the other lines of the story. Join me next episode as we look at the emergence of Lithuania. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.